It's April 1945. Berlin is no longer a city. It's a graveyard made of bricks and smoke. The thunder of Soviet artillery shakes the streets where parades once marched. Underground, in a bunker deep beneath the shattered capital, one man clings to a dying dream. Adolf Hitler, the architect of terror, the self-proclaimed savior of Germany, now hides beneath the ruins of his own empire. Once his words could command nations. Now they echo only off cold concrete walls. He still speaks of victory, of phantom armies that will rise and drive the Russians back. But outside, the truth roars louder than his lies. The Reich is collapsing. The cities he promised to rebuild are ashes. The soldiers he swore to protect are starving in the mud. Inside the bunker, time moves differently. Days melt into nights. Maps still hang on the walls, their arrows pointing nowhere. His generals whisper, his secretaries tremble, his dog lies restless at his feet. Every sound, every explosion above feels closer than the last. Still, he refuses to leave. They beg him to flee south to regroup in the mountains, but Hitler shakes his head. He will not run. He will not surrender. He would rather watch the world burn than see himself defeated. And yet behind those pale eyes, something begins to crumble. For the first time, the man who once believed himself chosen by fate begins to see what he cannot escape. The war is lost. The empire he built on fear and fire is turning to dust. And in that silence between shell bursts, Adolf Hitler finally begins to realize the 1,000-year Reich would not last 1,000 days. The walls of the bunker had begun to close in. The stale air carried the smell of oil, sweat, and despair. Above ground, Berlin was being torn apart piece by piece. The thunder of artillery never stopping, a constant, distant heartbeat of death. Every explosion sent a faint vibration through the floor, reminding those trapped below that the world outside was ending. Inside, Hitler sat hunched over a massive oak table covered in maps that no longer meant anything. The ink had begun to smudge. The pencil lines faded into meaninglessness. Those maps, once symbols of conquest, were now relics of delusion, ghosts of an empire that existed only in memory. Then came the message that shattered what little illusion he still clung to. A telegram, brief, cold, final. Hermann Goering, his oldest comrade, the man he had once called a brother, had written from Bavaria. The message was carefully worded. If Hitler was cut off and unable to command, Goering would assume leadership of the Reich. To anyone else, it was logic. To Hitler, it was betrayal of the highest order. The silence in the bunker broke like glass. Witnesses later said they had never seen him so pale. His hands trembled violently as he read the telegram again and again, as if disbelief could change the words. Then his voice erupted, shrill, furious, uncontrollable. "Treason!" he screamed. "Arrest Goering immediately." His outburst echoed through the corridors, bouncing off the damp concrete walls until it became almost a scream of the bunker itself. But beneath the anger was fear, the creeping realization that even those closest to him had stopped believing in victory. By that point, Germany itself was already collapsing. The country he had once promised to make eternal was dissolving under fire and rubble. Cities lay in ruins. Bridges had been blown to dust. Refugees poured across the countryside like rivers of ghosts. Mothers carried children through snow and ash. The Western Front was breaking under American armor. The East was drowning beneath the Soviet tide. Yet Hitler, deep underground, refused to accept it. He still clung to the illusion that some miracle would come, that the phantom divisions he imagined were waiting just beyond Berlin's horizon. He called for a counterattack led by General Felix Steiner. His voice rose with conviction, his hand cutting the air with old authority. But Steiner had no troops, no fuel, no ammunition. His division was a shadow, scattered men barely capable of defense, let alone attack. When the truth reached him that Steiner hadn't moved, that there was no counteroffensive, no army left to command, the last thread of denial snapped. The explosion wasn't outside, it was inside him. Hitler's rage became hysteria. He slammed his fists against the table until his knuckles split, shouting that he had been betrayed by everyone, his generals, his soldiers, even his people. "Cowards, traitors, incompetent!" he screamed. The room stood frozen. No one dared to move. That was the moment the myth cracked. For the first time, those around him saw not a leader of destiny, but a man consumed by madness. After the storm came silence. Hours later, when his officers returned, The transformation was complete. Hitler sat slumped in his chair, pale, hollow-eyed, the fire drained from his voice. "The war is lost," he said softly. The words hung in the air like a funeral bell. That day the Reich died before the man himself did. From then on his tone changed. No more grand speeches, no more promises of victory. He spoke instead of loyalty, of death, of ending things on his own terms. He told his staff he would stay in Berlin, that he would not flee, that he would not surrender. The bunker had become his fortress, his tomb, and his final stage. Above, Berlin burned like a torch in the night. Soviet artillery flattened streets. Flames swallowed entire neighborhoods. Civilians ran through choking smoke, clutching whatever scraps of life they could carry. Children hid in basements, covering their ears as buildings collapsed overhead. The SS destroyed records by the truckload, their last act of loyalty to a dream already dead. The once mighty capital had turned into a maze of ruin and silence, and it was that silence that haunted Hitler most. The silence of footsteps that no longer saluted. The silence in the eyes of officers who had stopped believing. It was the sound of power evaporating, and of history closing its fist around him. He still kept one symbol of hope on his desk, a small framed portrait of Frederick the Great, the Prussian king who had once snatched victory from the jaws of defeat. Hitler stared at it for hours, searching for an omen, a sign, anything to tell him the impossible could still happen. But the silence of the portrait offered no answer. By mid-April, the walls of the bunker no longer separated him from reality. Himmler, his loyal enforcer, had begun secret talks with the Allies. Goebbels had turned hollow, his speeches stripped of conviction. Generals were gone, dead, missing, or surrendering. The empire that once covered a continent now existed in a handful of smoke-stained rooms underground. The man who once promised eternity was now surrounded by decay. The war was over. Only the dying remained, and he knew it. The final blow came in the early hours of April 29th. Reports from the front confirmed that Soviet troops were only a few blocks away. The thunder of tank shells rattled the bunker walls like an approaching earthquake. Dust fell from the ceilings. Lights flickered. The air reeked of smoke, oil, and fear. Hitler sat motionless, staring at the reports laid before him. He didn't need to read them. He already knew. There would be no last stand, no miracle, no rescue. Only an ending. Yet the true realization didn't strike during a meeting or an argument. It came in silence. He walked into his private quarters, closed the door behind him, and stood before a mirror. The reflection staring back was not the conqueror of Europe. It was a pale, trembling man, shoulders stooped, eyes dull, hands shaking. The myth was gone. The face in the glass was old, frightened, and mortal. The Führer had vanished. Only Adolf Hitler remained. Even then, he tried to choreograph the end as he had choreographed everything else. He gave orders to burn every document that could humiliate him after death. He demanded that his body be destroyed, incinerated before the Soviets could touch it. The fate of Mussolini haunted him. The thought of being displayed like a carcass filled him with dread. Vanity, not remorse, consumed him. The bunker was collapsing into chaos. Food was scarce. The air was thick with the stench of decay and hopelessness. Secretaries wept in corners, clinging to each other in silence. Some chose cyanide over capture. Water pressure failed. The toilets overflowed. Rats scurried through the corridors. And in an act of grim practicality, Hitler ordered his dog, Blondie, to be poisoned, to ensure the capsules worked. When she collapsed, a strange stillness fell over him. Witnesses said he stared for a long time, saying nothing. It was as if the last thread of his humanity had died with her. That evening, another report arrived. Mussolini and his mistress had been executed, their bodies mutilated and strung up in Milan. Hitler read the details without expression. Then, almost to himself, he whispered, "I will not suffer Mussolini's fate." The decision was final. Death would come by his own hand. Before that, he performed one final ritual. In the dim light of the bunker, he married Eva Braun. The ceremony lasted only minutes. There were no flowers, no music, no witnesses beyond a handful of exhausted staff. They toasted with cheap champagne while the ceiling trembled above them. He thanked them all for their service. He seemed calm, eerily calm. One aide later said it was as if he had already crossed the line between life and death. Outside, the Soviets advanced through the ruins of Berlin. Every hour brought them closer. The city was nothing but smoke, fire, and screaming. SS troops fought to the last bullet in the streets, knowing it was futile. The empire had already ended. Only its shadow remained. On April 30th, just after midday, Hitler retreated to his study with Eva. His staff waited outside, listening to the muffled rumble of artillery. Minutes passed. Then a single gunshot echoed through the bunker. When the guards entered, they found him slumped on the sofa, a pistol in his hand. Eva lay beside him, her lips blue from cyanide. The man who once demanded absolute loyalty had finally kept his own promise, to die before surrender. His guards carried the bodies upstairs to the garden, placed them in a shallow crater, poured gasoline, and set them alight. Flames rose against the gray sky as shells burst nearby. Within minutes, the remains of the Third Reich's leader turned to ash. Days later, when Soviet soldiers entered the bunker, they found only ghosts, maps scattered, food half-eaten, the air heavy with smoke and silence. The war had consumed everything, even the man who started it. By May 2nd, Berlin surrendered. By May 8th, Nazi Germany was gone. The 1,000-year Reich had lasted barely 12. But myths have long shadows. Some refused to believe he was dead. Rumors spread that he had escaped to Argentina, that he lived under a false name waiting to return. For many, it was easier to believe in fantasy than to face the truth, that the man who promised destiny had died like a coward. The war wasn't lost in that bunker. It was lost years earlier, the moment Hitler began to believe in his own myth. The bunker was merely where the illusion collapsed. When the guns finally fell silent, Europe lay in ruins, cities flattened, families broken, generations scarred. All because of one man's madness. And in that silence, beneath the ashes of Berlin, the world learned a truth it would never forget. That hate can build an empire, but it can never sustain one. It didn't end with parades or glory. It ended in silence. One man's obsession consumed a nation, and his empire crumbled into dust. When the echoes faded, only the lessons remained. That power built on fear always collapses, and history never forgets those who tried to control it.